The Duke she once loved betrayed her. Now, 5 years later, he's back, and he's willing to sacrifice everything to win her heart. Can she trust him again? Or has he come to ruin her life all over again? Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Refused to Love. The autumn wind carried the scent of decay through Silverbrook Manor's gardens, a fitting perfume for the woman who walked among the dying roses. Lady Eveline Lancaster moved along the gravel path with practiced grace, her dark woolen cloak pulled tight against the October chill. The basket on her arm was empty. Now she had delivered the last of the blankets to Mrs. Henshaw in the village, the widow with 3 small children and a leaking roof that would need repair before winter truly set in. 5 years of this routine. 5 years of filling her days with duty so there was no room left for feeling. The garden gate creaked as she pushed through it, and Eveline paused, her hand resting on the weathered wood. These same roses had bloomed brilliantly once, their petals soft as silk, their fragrance sweet enough to make her dizzy with joy. Now they clung to withered vines, brown and brittle, refusing to let go even in death. She understood the impulse perfectly. "Eveline!" a young voice called out, bright with laughter. She turned to see Thomas and Margaret Fletcher, the blacksmith's son and the vicar's daughter, walking hand in hand along the road that bordered the manor grounds. They were recently engaged, their faces glowing with the kind of happiness that seemed to illuminate the grey afternoon. Thomas said something that made Margaret laugh, the sound carrying across the distance like bells. Eveline turned away sharply, pain lancing through her chest with such sudden intensity that she pressed her palm against her ribs. The gesture was automatic now, this physical response to witnessing joy she would never have again. She changed direction, moving toward the servants' entrance at the side of the manor. The main hall held too many memories, the grand staircase where she had descended in her finest gowns, the entrance where he had waited to escort her to balls and soirees, the very air thick with the ghost of who she used to be. The door opened before she reached it, and Martha appeared, her round face creased with the concern that had become her permanent expression over the past 5 years. "There you are, my lady," Martha said, reaching for the empty basket. "I was beginning to worry. The afternoon grows cold." "I'm quite well, Martha," Eveline replied, though they both knew it was a lie they'd been telling each other for half a decade. Inside, the manor was quiet, save for the distant sounds of the household staff going about their duties. Eveline removed her cloak, handing it to Martha, and moved toward the small sitting room she had claimed as her own. It was not the grand drawing room with its view of the rose gardens. That room had been locked since the day Alexander Hawke announced his engagement to another woman. "The post arrived while you were out," Martha said carefully, following Eveline into the sitting room. "And, my lady, I thought you should know. The dressmaker sent word. She's received the new fashion plates from London for the upcoming season." Eveline's hands, reaching for a vase of dried flowers on the side table, went completely still. "I have no need of fashion plates, Martha. You know I'm not going to London. But your father—" "My father cannot dictate where I spend my time," Eveline resumed, arranging the brittle stems, though her movements were more forceful now. A dried rose head snapped off, falling to the polished wood surface. "I am 26, not some girl fresh from the schoolroom who must parade about ballrooms seeking a husband." Martha was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentle. "You cannot hide here forever, my lady." The words struck too close to truth. Eveline's fingers closed around another dried rose, and suddenly she was somewhere else entirely, standing in this very garden on a June evening, roses in full bloom, their perfume intoxicating in the warm air. Alexander's hand had caught hers, and he'd plucked the most perfect bloom, placing it carefully in her palm. "Every season with you will be eternal spring," he had whispered, his dark eyes holding promises she'd believed with her whole heart. She'd pressed that rose in her journal. It was still there, brittle and brown, a monument to her own foolishness. "My lady?" Martha's voice pulled her back to the present. "Are you quite well?" Eveline blinked, realizing she'd crushed the dried flower in her fist, its fragments falling like ash. "Yes, perfectly well." A knock at the door interrupted whatever Martha might have said next. Mrs. Davison, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway, her expression apologetic. "Begging your pardon," Lady Eveline, but the Earl requests your presence in his study." Eveline's chest tightened. Her father's requests had become more frequent of late, and each conversation circled back to the same subject, her future, or rather, her lack of one. "Thank you, Mrs. Davison. Tell him I shall be there directly." As the housekeeper departed, Eveline caught sight of herself in the mirror above the mantelpiece. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the girl she'd been at 21. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a severe style, every strand controlled and contained. Her gown was a dark charcoal grey, not quite mourning, but close enough to signal to the world that she had removed herself from its pleasures. Her face, once quick to smile, had settled into an expression of cool composure that revealed nothing. She looked like a woman who had survived something, which, she supposed, was accurate enough. The walk to her father's study took her past the pianoforte in the music room. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that slanted through the windows, settling on the instrument's closed lid. She hadn't played in 5 years. Music required feeling, and feeling led to pain. She found her father seated behind his mahogany desk, afternoon light casting shadows that seemed to emphasize how thin he'd become. Charles Lancaster, Earl of Silverbrook, had always been a robust man, broad-shouldered and vigorous. But lately, had it been months now, he seemed diminished somehow, as though life itself was slowly draining from him. "Ah, Eveline," he smiled, but even that seemed to cost him effort. "Please, sit." She took the chair across from him, folding her hands in her lap with practiced calm. But she noticed things she hadn't wanted to see. The tremor in his hands as he set down his pen, the medicine bottles lined up on the corner of his desk like soldiers, the handkerchief quickly tucked into his pocket that bore suspicious dark spots. "Father, you're unwell," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "You should be resting, not, 'I'm perfectly fine, my dear.'" He waved away her concern with the same gesture he'd used when she was a child afraid of thunderstorms. "A persistent cough, nothing more. The doctor assures me it will pass." It was another lie they were telling each other, she realized. The manor seemed full of them lately. "I wanted to discuss the London season with you," he continued, and Eveline felt her spine stiffen. "I know you have refused to consider it, but—" "Father, please, we've had this conversation, and we shall have it again until you listen to reason." His voice was gentle but firm. "You cannot hide here forever, my dear. The world continues, even when hearts break. Your mother taught me that." The mention of her mother dead these 14 years, gone when Eveline was only 12, was a calculated move, and they both knew it. Catherine Lancaster had died bringing Eveline's brother into the world, and the baby had followed her within hours. The loss had devastated them both, but they had continued. Because one did, because there was no other choice. "I am not hiding," Eveline said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I am managing the estate, tending to our tenants, living a perfectly productive life. You are existing, not living. There is a difference." Her father leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I do not say this to cause you pain, Eveline, but you are 26. You should be dancing at balls, laughing with friends, building a life of your own. Perhaps even— No, the word came out sharper than she intended. "If you're suggesting marriage, I must respectfully decline. I have no interest in becoming some man's wife, some tool to be used for alliance or convenience. Not all marriages are made for such cold reasons. Your mother and I were fortunate." Eveline softened her tone. "But I have no desire to test fortune again." Her father studied her for a long moment, and she saw recognition in his eyes. He knew, of course. Everyone knew. The story of Lady Eveline Lancaster and the Duke of Hawke had been the scandal of the season 5 years ago, the young couple, so clearly in love, the expected engagement announcement, and then the shocking news that Alexander Hawke was to marry Lady Marianne Ashford instead. Society had whispered. Some pitied her. Others suggested she had failed to secure him properly. All of them had watched as she retreated from London, from society, from life itself. "There is another matter," her father said, his voice taking on a heaviness that made Eveline's pulse quicken. "The estate. There are repairs needed, significant ones. The roof on the eastern wing, the tenant cottages, the bridge that washed out last spring. Surely we have the funds." "Barely." He gestured to the ledgers spread across his desk. "Your grandfather was not prudent with investments. I have managed to maintain appearances, but a suitable marriage could ease these burdens considerably." There it was, the truth beneath all the gentle insistence. They needed money, and she was the solution he'd identified. I see. Eveline's voice was carefully controlled. You wish to sell me to the highest bidder? Eveline, no. Her father's face crumpled with hurt. I would never force you, never. But I worry about what will happen when I am gone. You will be alone, and the estate will be managed, she said firmly. I am not some helpless girl who needs a man to survive. You have taught me estate management. I know the tenants, the accounts, the land. I will manage perfectly well. A cough interrupted him, deep and racking, his whole body shaking with the force of it. Eveline half rose from her chair, but he waved her back, reaching for the handkerchief in his pocket. When he pulled it away from his mouth, she saw what he'd been trying to hide. Spots of blood. Father? A knock at the door cut off her alarm. Robert, their footman, entered with a silver salver. Begging your pardon, my lord, but a letter has arrived for Lady Eveline. The messenger said it was urgent. Eveline's gaze fell on the letter, and the world seemed to tilt beneath her. The seal was unmistakable, the Hawke family crest pressed into deep blue wax. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly, her knuckles went white. That will be all, Robert, her father said, his eyes on Eveline's face. The footman departed. The letter sat on the desk between them like a coiled serpent. You don't have to read it, her father said quietly, but they both knew she would. Some compulsions were stronger than reason. Eveline reached for the letter with a hand that trembled despite her best efforts at control. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind used by dukes and princes. She broke the seal, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might crack her ribs. The handwriting was achingly familiar. She'd spent hours studying it once, memorizing the way he formed his letters, the confident strokes that spoke of privilege and certainty. My dearest Eveline, 5 years have passed since I committed the greatest mistake of my life. I do not write seeking forgiveness. I know I deserve none. I write only to inform you that I am returning to London. I could not do so without warning you, as the sight of me might cause you pain, and I have caused you enough. If you wish me to avoid certain events or locations, you need only send word. Your comfort matters more to me than my presence in society. I remain, as I have always been, wholly and completely. She couldn't read further. Her hands were shaking too violently, the letters blurring before her eyes. 5 years of carefully constructed walls, of determined numbness, of sworn vows to never feel again, and a single letter had cracked the foundation. Eveline? Her father's voice seemed to come from very far away. What does it say? He's returning. The words scraped from her throat. Alexander, the Duke of Hawke, he's coming back to London. She stood abruptly, the letter crumpling in her fist. Excuse me, father, I find I need some air. She didn't wait for his response. She walked from the study with measured steps, maintaining the appearance of control until she reached her private chambers. Only then, with the door closed and locked behind her, did she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just learned. Alexander was coming back. Martha had laid a fire in the grate, unnecessary given the mild temperature, but comforting nonetheless. Eveline knelt before it, the letter still clutched in her hand. She should throw it in, burn it, let his words turn to ash, just as he had burned her heart to cinders. Coward, she whispered to the empty room. You think a letter absolves you? You think warning me makes it better? But even as anger coursed through her, another emotion warred for dominance, something dangerous and unwelcome that she'd thought she'd killed years ago. Hope. She threw the letter into the flames, watching as the edges curled and blackened, as Alexander's careful script dissolved into smoke. But it was too late. The words were already seared into her memory, his handwriting as familiar as her own heartbeat. I remain, as I have always been, wholly and completely. Wholly and completely what? Hers? In love with her? Sorry? It didn't matter. She wouldn't let it matter. That night, after Martha had helped her into her nightgown and brushed out her hair, after the household had settled into silence, Eveline stood before her bedroom mirror. Moonlight streamed through the windows, casting her reflection in silver and shadow. She looked like a ghost, a woman who existed in the space between life and death, never fully inhabiting either state. Her mother had died when she was 12. Alexander had destroyed her heart when she was 21, and in the 5 years since, she had become this, a woman who managed estates and delivered blankets and arranged dried flowers, but who never laughed, never danced, never allowed herself to feel anything deeper than mild contentment or mild irritation. She had survived. But Martha was right, she was not living. Never again, she whispered to her reflection, repeating the vow that had sustained her through 5 years of loneliness. I will never open my heart to him again. Never. But even as she spoke the words with all the conviction she could muster, a treacherous part of her soul, the part she thought she'd buried alongside her hopes and dreams, whispered back, what if? What if he'd changed? What if there were explanations she'd never heard? What if 5 years had transformed him as completely as they'd transformed her? What if she was strong enough to risk the pain again? No, she said aloud, turning sharply from the mirror. She climbed into bed, pulling the coverlet up to her chin as though it could protect her from her own thoughts. Some doors, once closed, must remain locked forever. But as she lay in the darkness, listening to the wind rattle the windows and the old manor creak and settle around her, she knew the truth. Alexander Hawke's return had already changed everything. The door she'd locked so carefully that she'd sworn would never open again was already beginning to crack, and she was terrified of what or who might walk through. Chapter 2. The Duke's Desperate Return. London assaulted the senses in a way that 5 years of country living had made Eveline forget. The noise alone, carriages clattering over cobblestones, street vendors hawking their wares, the endless hum of humanity pressed together in 2 small spaces, felt overwhelming after the quiet solitude of Silverbrook Manor. Their townhouse in Mayfair stood narrow and elegant between 2 larger residences, a modest establishment befitting an earl of comfortable but not extravagant means. The staff had arrived 2 days prior to air out the rooms and remove the Holland covers from furniture that had sat untouched since Eveline's last season, that disastrous season that had ended with her heart in pieces and her retreat to the countryside. It's smaller than I remembered, Eveline said as their carriage drew to a stop before the black lacquered door. Everything seems smaller when viewed through the lens of pain, her father replied, his voice gentle. He'd been solicitous during the 3-day journey from Harlow Heath, careful not to press too hard on the subject of why they'd come. But they both knew. His health was declining, the estate needed attention that required London connections, and he refused to die without seeing his daughter rejoin the living, even if she had no intention of actually doing so. The first 2 days passed in a blur of reopening the household meeting with the housekeeper, reviewing accounts, receiving calls from neighbours who remembered the Earl of Silverbrook and were curious about his daughter's return. Eveline deflected their questions with practiced ease, her mask of cool politeness firmly in place. On the 3rd evening, her father appeared in the doorway of her sitting room, dressed in his evening finery. The Harleston ball is tonight, he announced. We're attending. Eveline looked up from the letter she was writing, a missive to their steward about tenant cottages. Father, I don't think... It's early in the season. Not too overwhelming. Lady Harleston was your mother's dear friend. It would be an insult not to appear. His tone brooked no argument, though his eyes remained kind. You needn't dance if you don't wish to. Simply be seen. Let society know you've returned. And so Eveline found herself in her dressing room that evening, Martha fussing over her hair while a deep burgundy gown lay spread across the bed. Not quite mourning, that would be inappropriate given she mourned no one officially, but not quite the vibrant colours of a woman fully engaged with life. It's a beautiful gown, my lady, Martha said, meeting Eveline's eyes in the mirror. The colour suits you. It's acceptable. Eveline's voice was flat. Martha's hands stilled in her hair. They say the Duke of Hawke has returned from his country estates, arrived in London just last week, according to the gossip. Eveline's spine stiffened, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. London is full of dukes, Martha. I'm sure I can avoid one. Of course, my lady. But Martha's tone suggested she knew better. An hour later, Eveline descended the stairs in her burgundy silk, her hair dressed simply but elegantly, pearls at her throat, her mother's pearls, the only jewellery she ever wore. Her father waited in the entrance hall, and when he saw her, something like sadness crossed his face. You look so like your mother, he said softly, but she would have wanted to see you smile, Eveline. Perhaps I've forgotten how. The carriage ride to Harleston House was mercifully brief. As they approached, Eveline could see the blaze of light spilling from every window, could hear the faint strains of orchestra music drifting into the November night. Her stomach twisted with something that might have been anxiety or might have been dread. We needn't stay long, her father said, as though reading her thoughts. An hour, perhaps 2, just enough to be seen. Harleston House was a crush precisely the sort of event Eveline had once loved and now loathed. The entrance hall blazed with what seemed like 1,000 candles, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow prisms across the marble floors. Ladies in silks of every color swept past like exotic birds, gentlemen in their blacks and whites providing stark contrast. The air was thick with perfume, beeswax, and the heat of too many bodies pressed together. Eveline felt suffocated immediately. They were announced the Earl of Silverbrook and Lady Eveline Lancaster, and a ripple of interest moved through the nearby guests. She felt their eyes, heard the whispered speculations. That's her, the one the Duke of Hawk jilted. I heard she went quite mad with grief. 5 years in the country, can you imagine? She lifted her chin and moved through the crowd as though she heard nothing, felt nothing. The ballroom was even more overwhelming, a sea of swirling dancers, the orchestra playing a waltz that tugged at memories she'd tried to bury. She made her way to the periphery, positioning herself near a cluster of potted palms where she might observe without being expected to participate. Eveline? Eveline Lancaster? She turned to find a woman approaching, her face alight with genuine pleasure. It took Eveline a moment to place her Beatrice Thornton, though the surname would be different now. They'd been friends once, before everything fell apart. Beatrice. Eveline managed a small smile. It's been a long time. 5 years. Beatrice took both of Eveline's hands in hers, squeezing gently. I've missed you desperately. When I heard you'd returned to London, I hardly dared hope I'd see you so soon. My father insisted. The words came out more bitter than Eveline intended, and she softened them with, but I'm glad to see a friendly face. Beatrice was still lovely, perhaps lovelier than she'd been at 20. Marriage clearly agreed with her. I'm Lady Pemberton now. Can you believe it? Robert proposed 3 years ago, and I was foolish enough to accept. The self-deprecating humor was so characteristic of Beatrice that Eveline felt something in her chest loosen slightly. I'm happy for you. Are you? Beatrice's eyes were knowing. You look beautiful as always, but you don't look happy. Before Eveline could formulate a response that was both honest and safe, Beatrice's expression shifted to something more cautious. Eveline, I should tell you he's here. Alexander, the Duke of Hawk. He arrived in London last week. Everyone's talking about why he suddenly returned after years of rustication in the country. Eveline's breath caught, her carefully maintained composure fracturing for just an instant. I see. I thought you should be prepared. In case, Beatrice hesitated, in case you encounter him. Thank you for the warning. Eveline's voice was steady, but her hands had begun to tremble. She clasped them together, hiding them in the folds of her gown. Though London is a large city, I'm sure our paths need not cross. But even as she spoke, her eyes betrayed her, scanning the crowded ballroom without her permission. And then, as though fate itself conspired against her careful control, she saw him. Alexander Hawk stood on the far side of the ballroom, and the sight of him drove the air from Eveline's lungs. He was still devastatingly handsome, tall and broad-shouldered, his evening clothes fitted to perfection. But 5 years had left their mark. His dark hair, once uniformly black, now showed silver at the temples. His face, which had held such arrogant confidence when last she'd seen him, was leaner now, harder somehow. And his eyes, those dark eyes that had once promised her eternity, held shadows that spoke of sleepless nights and private suffering. He was speaking with Lord Pemberton, but his gaze constantly moved across the room, searching for her. She realized with a jolt that went through her like lightning, and then their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. Time stopped. The orchestra faded to nothing. The crush of bodies disappeared. 5 years collapsed into a single, endless moment. She saw recognition flash across his face, then longing so naked and profound it made her chest ache, and beneath that, regret deeper than any ocean. Eveline turned away sharply, her heart hammering so violently she thought she might faint. She couldn't breathe. The ballroom was too hot, too crowded, too much. I need air, she said to Beatrice, already moving toward the terrace doors. Eveline, wait. But she was already walking, her steps quick despite the crowd. She slipped through the French doors onto the terrace, where November air hit her overheated skin like a blessing. The terrace was mercifully empty, most guests preferring the warmth inside. She gripped the stone balustrade, drawing in deep breaths, trying to steady herself. Seeing him had been a mistake. Coming to London had been a mistake. She should have stayed at Silverbrook. Should have. Lady Eveline. His voice deeper than she remembered, rougher with emotion, came from behind her. She'd felt his presence the moment he stepped onto the terrace, as though her body recognized him before her mind could protest. She didn't turn. "Your Grace, how unexpected." The ice in her tone could have frozen the Thames. "Eveline, please." She heard him move closer, though he maintained a respectable distance. "Just look at me." She turned slowly, drawing on every ounce of self-control she possessed. Her face was a mask of cold politeness as she met his eyes. "I am looking at you, Your Grace. Was there something specific you required?" His composure cracked. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands clenched at his sides. 5 minutes of your time. That's all I ask." "You asked for far more than that once." The words came out sharp as glass. "I seem to recall I gave you everything, my heart, my trust, my future. How did that work out? Eveline, did you receive what you wanted? Did choosing duty over love bring you happiness? Did Lady Marianne make you a good wife?" Alexander stepped closer, and she caught the scent of him sandalwood and something uniquely his that made her traitorous body remember things she'd sworn to forget. "You have every right to hate me. God knows I hate myself for what I did to you." "I don't hate you, Your Grace." She lifted her chin, her voice deadly calm. "Hate requires caring. I simply don't think of you at all. It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie. But she needed him to believe it, needed the armor of indifference between them. "I didn't want to leave," he said, his voice raw. "I had no choice. There is always a choice." She cut him off, years of buried pain suddenly surging to the surface. "You made yours. Live with it." She moved to step past him, to escape back into the ballroom and the safety of crowds. But his hand caught her wrist gently, carefully, but the touch sent electricity racing up her arm that made her gasp. "Please, Eveline, let me explain. There are things you don't know. Things I couldn't tell you then, but—" She wrenched her wrist free, and immediately her skin felt cold where his fingers had been. "I know everything I need to know. You chose duty over love. You chose your family's expectations over me. You made your choice devastatingly clear when you announced your betrothal to Lady Marianne without even the courtesy of telling me first." Her voice broke despite her best efforts. "I learned of it at a ball, Your Grace, exactly like this one, from pitying whispers and knowing looks, from watching other ladies' faces fill with sympathy while they wondered what was wrong with me that I couldn't secure you." Alexander's face drained of all color. "God, Eveline, I tried to tell you. I sent letters. I came to your house, but you wouldn't receive me. And I burned your letters, just as you burned my heart." She felt tears threatening and forced them back through sheer will. "Did you expect me to read your excuses, your justifications for destroying me? Eveline, your father is looking for you." Beatrice's voice cut through the tension. She stood in the terrace doorway, her expression sympathetic but firm. Eveline had never been more grateful for an interruption. "Thank you, Lady Pemberton." Eveline smoothed her skirts, with hands that shook only slightly. "I was just coming inside." "Eveline, wait." Alexander's voice was desperate now. "I won't give up. I can't. Not when I finally found the courage to fight for what I should have fought for 5 years ago." She turned back to look at him one last time. In the moonlight, he looked haunted, a man carrying the weight of his mistakes like stones around his neck. "Then you'll be fighting alone, Your Grace." Her voice was quiet but final. "Good evening." She walked past Beatrice into the ballroom, her spine straight and her head high, but inside she was shattering all over again. The carriage ride home was silent until her father said gently, "I saw you speaking with the Duke of Hawk." "It was nothing." Eveline kept her voice steady. "A brief exchange of cold pleasantries. He looked at you the way I once looked at your mother." Her father's voice held a knowing sadness. "With the eyes of a man who knows he's lost the only thing that matters, then he should look elsewhere." Eveline's hands twisted in her lap. "That door is closed." But her hands were shaking, and her father noticed. He said nothing, only placed his hand over hers in quiet comfort. Back in her bedroom, Martha helped her undress in silence, sensing her lady's need for quiet. When Eveline was finally alone in her nightgown, the door locked and the world shut out. She allowed the mask to crumble. She sank onto her bed, pressing her palm to her chest where her heart raced painfully. She could still feel where his fingers had circled her wrist the first time he'd touched her in 5 years. The sensation burned like a brand, marking her skin as surely as his abandonment had marked her soul. "I don't think of you at all," she had said. The greatest lie she'd ever told. Because the truth, the terrible, inescapable truth was this. She had thought of him every single day for 5 years, in her waking hours and in her dreams, in her anger and in her grief. In the moments when she looked at her reflection and saw a ghost instead of a woman, she had built her entire life around not feeling, around protecting herself from the pain of loving Alexander Hawke. And seeing him again, seeing the regret in his eyes, hearing the raw emotion in his voice, feeling his touch on her skin, had unleashed every carefully buried feeling she'd sworn was dead. Eveline reached for her pillow, buried her face in it, and finally allowed herself to weep, for the girl she'd been, for the love she'd lost, for the 5 years she'd spent existing instead of living, and for the terrifying realization that despite everything, despite the pain and the betrayal and the carefully constructed walls around her heart, some traitorous part of her still loved Alexander Hawke. God help her, but she still loved him. Chapter 3. The Truth Unveiled. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the breakfast room, casting delicate patterns across the polished mahogany table. Eveline sat with a cup of tea growing cold before her, a letter from the estate steward lying unread in her lap. She had been staring at the same paragraph for 10 minutes, the words refusing to coalesce into meaning. Her mind was elsewhere. It had been elsewhere for the past week, ever since the Harleston ball. Alexander had been everywhere, or perhaps she had simply become hyper-aware of his presence. At Lady Pemberton's musicale, standing near the windows while she sat in the back row, at the theatre, his box directly across from theirs, his gaze finding her during intermission. At the exhibition at Somerset House, maintaining a respectful distance but always watching. He never approached, never forced conversation, but she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, pressing against the carefully constructed walls around her heart. "My lady," Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned. "You've hardly touched your breakfast." "I'm not hungry." Eveline set down the letter, abandoning any pretense of productivity. "Has my father risen yet?" "He's still abed, my lady. His cough kept him awake most of the night." Martha's worry was evident. "Perhaps we should send for the physician." "I suggested as much yesterday." He refused. Eveline's hands tightened in her lap. Her father's cough had grown steadily worse since their arrival in London, the damp November air aggravating whatever ailment plagued him. But he dismissed her concerns with the same stubbornness that had brought them to London in the first place. "A card has arrived for you, my lady." Martha produced a small envelope from her pocket. "Hand-delivered this morning." Eveline took it with a sense of foreboding that proved justified the moment she saw the name. Lady Catherine Hawke. Her breath caught. Catherine, Alexander's younger sister. They had been friends once, before everything fell apart, not close friends, perhaps, but friendly enough. Catherine had been only 17 when the scandal broke, still in the schoolroom, and Eveline had neither seen nor heard from her in 5 years. "Lady Catherine Hawke requests the honour of calling upon Lady Eveline Lancaster this afternoon, if it would be convenient." Eveline should refuse. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to send a polite declination, but curiosity, that dangerous, compelling thing, won out over caution. "Send word that I will receive Lady Catherine at 2 o'clock, she told Martha. The hours until Catherine's arrival passed with excruciating slowness. Eveline changed her gown 3 times before settling on a simple day dress in dove grey. She ordered tea prepared, then countermanded the order in favour of sherry, then changed her mind again. By the time Martha announced Lady Catherine's arrival, Eveline's nerves were strung tight as piano wire. Catherine Hawke had grown from a girl into a woman in 5 years. She entered the drawing room with a quiet grace, her warm brown eyes so unlike Alexander's dark intensity. Where the Dowager Duchess of Hawke had always been cold and aristocratic, Catherine radiated genuine warmth. She was dressed simply but elegantly, and her hands twisted nervously in her gloves. "Lady Eveline," Catherine curtsied, her voice soft. "Thank you for receiving me. I wasn't certain you would." "Lady Catherine," Eveline gestured to the settee. "Please sit. Will you take tea?" They observed the rituals of politeness, tea poured, pleasantries exchanged about the weather and the season, but tension hummed beneath the surface, and finally Catherine set down her cup with a decisive clink. "I know you have no reason to receive me kindly," she said, meeting Eveline's eyes directly. "My family destroyed your happiness." "Your brother destroyed it," Eveline corrected, her voice cool. "You owe me no apology." "But I owe you the truth." Catherine leaned forward, earnestness in every line of her body. Alexander wouldn't want me to tell you he believes he should suffer your hatred as penance, but I cannot watch two people I love remain in pain because of a misunderstanding. Eveline's spine stiffened. There was no misunderstanding. He chose Lady Marianne. He announced his engagement. The facts are clear. The facts, yes, but not the truth behind them. Catherine drew a deep breath. 5 years ago, my father lay dying of consumption. Alexander was courting you, he told me. He planned to propose after the Devonshire ball. He was happier than I'd ever seen him. A memory flashed unbidden. Alexander in the garden at Silverbrook, moonlight in his hair, promising her eternal spring. Eveline pushed it away. Then father summoned Alexander to his bedside. Catherine continued. I wasn't in the room, but I heard them shouting. Father's voice carried through the entire house, even as weak as he was. You will marry Lady Marianne Ashford, he said, uniting our estates, or I will disinherit you and leave Catherine without dowry or protection. The Hawke legacy will end in disgrace. Eveline's hands stilled on her teacup. Alexander tried to refuse. I heard him say, Father, I love another. But father, Catherine's voice broke slightly. Father said love was a luxury our family couldn't afford. Duty before all, he told Alexander, or you are no son of mine. The drawing room felt suddenly airless. Eveline set down her tea before her trembling hands could betray her. Alexander resisted for 3 days, Catherine said. He barely slept. I would hear him pacing in his rooms at night. But father's condition worsened. He began saying he would die without reconciling with Alexander, that he would curse him from the grave if he defied him. And your mother, Eveline's voice came out hoarse, sided with father. She always did. Bitterness crept into Catherine's tone. She told Alexander he was selfish, that he would ruin my life, my prospects, my future for his own desires. She said, what kind of man would sacrifice his sister's happiness for a passing fancy? A passing fancy. The words tasted like ash. Is that what I was to her? You were everything to Alexander. But mother, Catherine shook her head. Mother has never understood love. Hers was an arranged marriage. She believes all marriages should be the same. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. Alexander came to my room one night. He looked destroyed. He said, I can bear father's disappointment. I can even bear being cut off. But I cannot let you suffer for my happiness. You're 19, Catherine. You deserve a season, a future. I won't let them take that from you because I chose to follow my heart. Eveline closed her eyes, but that only made it worse. She could picture it too clearly. Alexander, young and trapped, choosing between impossible options. He sacrificed his happiness for mine, Catherine whispered. He wrote to you, tried to explain, but you'd already heard the announcement. Mother insisted on making it public immediately, before Alexander could change his mind. I learned of it at the Worthington ball, Eveline said quietly, from Lady Ashford herself. She looked so triumphant when she told me her daughter had secured the Duke of Hawke. I'm so sorry. Catherine reached across the space between them, though she didn't quite touch Eveline's hand. The engagement was announced, and Lady Marianne was satisfied. She wanted the title, the prestige. But Alexander was a ghost. He went through the motions, but anyone with eyes could see his heart wasn't in it. How long? Eveline heard herself ask. How long was he engaged to her? 8 months. Father died in March. His last words to Alexander were, You did your duty. The Hawke name is secure. Catherine's voice hardened, as though that was all that mattered, as though Alexander's heart was a small price to pay for the family legacy. And then, Alexander dissolved the engagement 2 weeks after father's funeral. Eveline's head snapped up. He what? He ended it, immediately. Lady Marianne was furious. She'd already been planning the wedding, ordering her trousseau. She tried to sue for breach of promise. Alexander paid her off with a substantial sum to avoid scandal, and sent her to Paris with enough money to establish herself in society there. The world tilted beneath Eveline's feet. I didn't know. No one said. Alexander made sure it was handled quietly. He didn't want more scandal. Catherine's voice softened. He spent the next 5 years managing father's debts, and there were many, though we hadn't known the extent, and restoring the estates father had neglected. He tried to write to you, multiple times. I returned his letters unopened. Shame burned in Eveline's throat. He stayed away because he thought you'd moved on, that you'd found happiness without him, and he had no right to disturb your peace. Catherine met Eveline's eyes. Then, last month, he encountered an old friend who mentioned you'd never married. that you'd withdrawn from society completely. That's when he realized. Realized what? That he'd broken you, just as surely as you'd broken him. Catherine's voice was gentle. He couldn't bear it anymore, Eveline. He had to try to make amends, even if you could never forgive him, even if the best he could hope for was your indifference instead of your hatred. Eveline sat in stunned silence, her mind racing to reorder 5 years of assumptions. The villain of her story, the man who had chosen duty over love, who had destroyed her without a second thought, had never been a villain at all. He had been trapped, cornered, forced to choose between impossible options, and he had spent 5 years suffering as much as she had. "I don't expect you to forgive him," Catherine said, rising from the settee. "I don't expect you to love him again. I just wanted you to know. He loved you. He never stopped. The choice he made wasn't about not loving you, it was about loving his family too much to let them be destroyed." After Catherine left, Eveline sat alone in the drawing room as shadows lengthened and afternoon gave way to evening. Everything she had believed, every assumption that had shaped the past 5 years, lay shattered around her like broken glass. She had been so certain, so righteous in her anger, and she had been so wrong. That afternoon, desperate to escape the confines of the townhouse and her own spiraling thoughts, Eveline walked to Hyde Park. The November air was crisp, the trees nearly bare of leaves. She walked without direction, Catherine's words echoing in her mind. "He sacrificed his happiness for mine. He loved you. He never stopped." She was so lost in thought that she didn't see the figure ahead of her until she nearly collided with him. "Forgive me. I wasn't watching." Alexander's voice cut off abruptly as recognition dawned. "Eveline." They stood frozen on the path, alone in this less-traveled section of the park. His eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Your sister visited me today," Eveline said, the words escaping before she could consider them. Alexander's face drained of color. "Catherine, what did she—" He stopped, closing his eyes briefly. "She told you. Why didn't you tell me yourself? That first night at the ball? Because it sounds like an excuse." His voice was raw. "Because I made a choice, whatever my reasons, and you suffered for it. Because I don't deserve your understanding, let alone your forgiveness." Silence fell between them, heavy with 5 years of pain and misunderstanding. "You could have told me," Eveline said quietly. "Trusted me. We could have faced it together." "I know." The words seemed torn from him. "That was my greatest failure, not trusting our love to be strong enough. I was 23 and terrified and arrogant enough to think I had to bear it alone. By the time I realized my mistake, you'd closed your heart to me. And I couldn't blame you. I'd given you every reason to hate me." Eveline looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since that night at Harleston House. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the lines of suffering that hadn't been there 5 years ago, the weight of regret he carried like chains. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to understand what this means." "Take all the time you need." Relief and hope warred in his expression. "I've waited 5 years. I can wait longer." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Eveline, I know you probably don't believe this, but I never touched her, never kissed her. The engagement was on paper only. My heart has only ever belonged to one woman." He walked away, leaving Eveline standing alone on the path, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. That night, long after the household had retired, Eveline found herself in the drawing room, kneeling before the cold fireplace. She had dismissed the servants, claiming she wanted to read, but the book lay forgotten on the settee. Instead, she reached into the grate where, weeks ago at Silverbrook, she had burned Alexander's letter. The ash had long been cleaned away, but she had kept the fragment some perverse need to hold on to proof of her righteousness, perhaps. Now, in the dim light of a single candle, she could make out a few words scattered across the charred pieces. "Greatest mistake. Never stopped. If you can ever." She held the fragments carefully, as though they were precious rather than the detritus of her anger. What if she had read it? What if she had listened instead of running? What if she had fought for him the way Catherine said he'd fought for her, silently, privately, with no one to witness his sacrifice? The villain of her story had never been a villain at all. He had been a young man caught between impossible choices, trying to protect the people he loved, even as it destroyed him. And she had spent 5 years hating him for it. Her anger, her armor, her carefully constructed walls, they had all been built on a foundation of incomplete truth. And now that foundation was crumbling, leaving her standing in the ruins of her own certainty. "What do I do now?" she whispered into the darkness. The house offered no answer. The fire was cold, the room silent. But her heart, her treacherous, foolish heart, that had never stopped loving Alexander Hawke, despite 5 years of trying, whispered softly, "Give him a chance. Trust him as he should have trusted you. Don't let pride destroy what pain couldn't quite kill." Eveline closed her eyes, the fragments of ash still cradled in her palms, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd learned. Alexander had loved her, had never stopped loving her. And perhaps it wasn't too late to find their way back to each other. Chapter 4. Shadows and Schemes. 2 weeks had passed since Catherine's revelation, and London had begun to whisper. The Duke of Hawke and Lady Lancaster, seen together at Lady Pemberton's musicale. His Grace accompanied Lady Eveline to the botanical exhibition. They attended the theatre with her father as chaperone, naturally, but still. Eveline heard the whispers, saw the speculative glances. Society, ever hungry for romance, had seized upon their cautious reconnection with gleeful interest. Were they courting? Would there be an engagement? Had the Duke finally come to his senses? She tried not to care what they said, tried to focus instead on the fragile thing growing between herself and Alexander, tentative as spring's first shoots, easily crushed but stubbornly persistent. They had established a truce of sorts. Polite conversations at gatherings, careful distance maintained, propriety observed. But something was shifting, rebuilding itself brick by careful brick. "You're smiling," Beatrice observed one afternoon as they sat in her drawing room awaiting the other guests for an intimate gathering. "I haven't seen you smile like that in years." Eveline touched her lips, surprised to find them curved upward. "Was I?" "You were thinking of him." Beatrice's tone was knowing but kind. "It's written all over your face." Before Eveline could formulate a denial, Alexander arrived with several other guests. Their eyes met across the room, and something warm unfurled in her chest, something she'd thought long dead. The gathering was small, perhaps a dozen people, the conversation turning naturally to books and poetry. Eveline found herself drawn into a discussion of Gothic novels, with Alexander standing near enough that she could catch the scent of sandalwood that always clung to him. "I confess I never understood the appeal," Lord Pembroke was saying. "All those crumbling castles and mysterious monks. Surely real life provides sufficient drama." "But that's precisely the point," Eveline countered, animated in a way she hadn't been in years. "The Gothic allows us to explore fears and desires that polite society forbids us to acknowledge. The heroine trapped in the castle is every woman who has felt constrained by society's expectations." "Well argued, Lady Eveline," Alexander said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her pulse quicken. "I recall you were always passionate about Mrs. Radcliffe's work." She turned to him, surprised. "You remember that?" "I remember everything." The words were soft, meant only for her ears. Then, with a slight smile, "Though I confess I attempted to read The Mysteries of Udolpho once, hoping to better understand your fascination, I found it delightfully absurd." Eveline laughed, actually laughed, the sound startling even to her own ears. "You didn't." "I did. Made it halfway through before admitting defeat, though I appreciated the commitment to atmospheric gloom." His eyes crinkled with genuine humor. "Emily spent rather a lot of time fainting, as I recall. She was in distressing circumstances. She was in a castle, with meals provided. I've endured worse." The absurdity of it, the Duke of Hawke solemnly reading Gothic novels to understand her, struck Eveline as impossibly endearing, and she laughed again. The sound seemed to crack something open in her chest, letting light into spaces that had been dark for far too long. Across the room, Beatrice caught Eveline's eye and smiled with unmistakable approval. 3 days later, Alexander invited Eveline and her father to join him at Covent Garden for a performance of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. The Earl had accepted with an enthusiasm that worried Eveline. He seemed frailer each day, his cough a constant companion, but she couldn't deny him this small pleasure. Alexander's box was perfectly positioned, offering an excellent view of the stage. He was attentive but not overwhelming, ensuring they had refreshments, that her father was comfortable, that the temperature suited them. "This was kind of you, Your Grace," the Earl said, settling into his seat with evident relief. "I haven't attended the theatre in years." "The pleasure is entirely mine, my lord." Alexander's gaze flickered to Eveline. "I hope the choice of play is acceptable?" "More than acceptable." Eveline smoothed her skirts, acutely aware of how close Alexander sat. I've always loved this one." As the performance began, Eveline found herself genuinely absorbed in the story Beatrice and Benedict's sparring, the cruel deception practiced on Hero, the eventual triumph of truth and love. During a particularly tender scene, her hand rested on the armrest between her seat and Alexander's. His hand moved, settling beside hers. Their fingers didn't quite touch, but she could feel the warmth of him, mere inches away. She should move her hand. Propriety demanded it. She didn't move her hand. Neither did he. They sat like that through the rest of the first act, not quite touching but connected nonetheless. When she dared glance at her father, she found him watching them with a slight smile on his weary face. During intermission, Alexander brought them refreshments, champagne for the gentlemen, orgeat for Eveline. They discussed the performance, the actors, the timeless nature of Shakespeare's observations about love and pride. "Much ado about nothing indeed," Alexander said quietly, his eyes on Eveline. "All that pain, all that misunderstanding, because two people were too proud to speak honestly about their feelings." "Yes," Eveline said softly, "though in the end, truth prevails." "In the end," he agreed, "if they're brave enough to trust it." For the first time in 5 years, Eveline realized she was genuinely enjoying herself, not merely enduring social obligation or going through expected motions, but actually feeling pleasure, anticipation, joy. The realization was both wonderful and terrifying. The next morning, that fragile happiness shattered over breakfast. "My lady," Martha said carefully, setting down the morning papers, "there's mention in the society columns about Lady Marianne Ashford." Eveline's stomach clenched. She unfolded the paper with hands that wanted to tremble. "Lady Marianne Ashford has returned from Paris, where she has been residing these past years, and is taking up residence at her brother's London home. Society eagerly anticipates her return to the season's festivities." "That's the lady who was engaged to the Duke, isn't it?" Martha asked, her concern evident. "That was years ago." Eveline forced her voice to remain steady. "It's nothing to do with me." But the lie tasted bitter, and anxiety took root in her chest like thorns. That afternoon, Eveline and Beatrice took tea at Fortnum and Mason, hoping the elegant surroundings might ease Eveline's growing unease. They were discussing the theatre performance when Beatrice's expression shifted, her eyes fixing on something over Eveline's shoulder. "Don't look now," she whispered. "But Lady Marianne has just entered." Eveline couldn't help herself. She turned. Lady Marianne Ashford was stunning, there was no other word for it. She wore the latest Parisian fashion, a walking dress of emerald silk that made her pale skin glow and her auburn hair shine like copper. She moved through the tea-room with the confidence of a woman who knew every eye was upon her. "Don't let her intimidate you," Beatrice murmured. "She's all polish and no substance." But it was too late. Marianne had spotted them and was approaching with deliberate grace. "Lady Lancaster." Marianne's smile was beautiful and venomous. "What a surprise! I heard you'd emerged from your country exile." "Lady Marianne," Eveline kept her voice cool. "Welcome back to London." "How kind." Marianne's eyes swept over Eveline's simple morning dress, and something like pity crossed her perfect features. "I understand you've been seen with Alexander." "How?" "Nostalgic. Revisiting old attachments can be so comforting, can't it? Though one should be careful not to mistake nostalgia for genuine feeling." The barb landed precisely where intended. Eveline felt it lodge between her ribs but refused to react. "I'm sure we'll see much of each other this season," Marianne continued, her tone suggesting this was a threat rather than a pleasantry. "London is so small, after all, especially certain circles." She swept away to join her companions, leaving poison in her wake. "Insufferable woman," Beatrice muttered. "Pay her no mind, Eveline. She's simply jealous that Alexander chose you over her." But over the next week, Eveline couldn't escape Marianne's presence. She was everywhere, at every ball, every musicale, every gathering. And always, she positioned herself near Alexander. At the Ashworth ball, Marianne interrupted their dance with profuse apologies, claiming she desperately needed Alexander's advice on a matter of urgent business. He excused himself with visible reluctance, but he went. At a garden party, Marianne's voice carried across the lawn. "Do you remember when Alexander and I were engaged? Such lovely parties we attended together. He was always so attentive. She never did anything overtly scandalous. She was too clever for that." But each small interaction planted seeds of doubt in Eveline's mind, made her feel like an outsider to a life that Alexander and Marianne had once shared. 10 days after Marianne's return, Eveline sought refuge in Hatchard's bookshop, that sanctuary of quiet and literature. She was browsing the shelves when she heard voices from the next aisle, voices she recognized with a start. "Marianne, I've told you repeatedly." Alexander's voice was tight with frustration. "Darling, don't be stubborn." Marianne's tone was honeyed persuasion. "We were so good together once. Your family approved of me. Society expected us to marry. That little interlude with Lady Lancaster was just youthful fancy." Eveline froze, her hand still on the book she'd been reaching for. "It wasn't a fancy." Alexander's voice was firm, almost angry. Is the only genuine love I've ever known." Eveline's heart leapt, even as she knew she shouldn't be listening, shouldn't be standing here eavesdropping like a character in one of her Gothic novels. "Love?" Marianne laughed, the sound brittle. "Alexander, be practical. She's damaged goods now, a spinster who hid away for 5 years. What will people say? Whereas I have maintained my position in society, my connections. I could be an asset to you. I don't care what people say." The coldness in Alexander's voice made Eveline shiver. "I love Eveline. I've always loved Eveline, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to her if she'll let me." Joy and terror warred in Eveline's chest. She had heard him defend her, declare his love with utter conviction. Then Marianne's voice turned calculating. "Are you certain about that? Because I wonder if Lady Lancaster knows about the letters." Silence. Then, "What letters?" "Oh, haven't I mentioned? I've kept certain correspondence from those years. Letters that might be misconstrued. It would be such a shame if they became public, casting doubt on the narrative of your great, undying love." "You're bluffing." But there was uncertainty in Alexander's voice now. "I never wrote you any letters beyond formal pleasantries. Are you willing to risk Eveline's reputation on that certainty?" Marianne's voice dripped false sweetness. "Think carefully, Alexander. You have until week's end to reconsider my offer of renewed acquaintance. Otherwise, I'll have no choice but to share these interesting documents with the right people." Eveline's heart hammered. She needed to leave, to think, to... She slipped from the shop before they could discover her presence, her mind spinning. Alexander loved her, she had heard him say it, heard the conviction in his voice. But what were these letters? What hold did Marianne truly have over him? That evening, alone in her room, Eveline wrestled with herself. She wanted to trust Alexander. Catherine's story, his actions over the past weeks, everything pointed to his sincerity. But 5 years of pain had taught her caution. What if there was more to the story? What if she was being foolish again, opening her heart only to have it shattered? She made a decision. She needed to speak with Alexander directly, to understand what Marianne was threatening. She penned a note in her careful hand. "We need to speak privately. Tomorrow at Hyde Park, the old meeting place. E." She sent it that evening and waited for a reply. None came. The next afternoon, Eveline went to their old meeting spot, a secluded bench overlooking the Serpentine, where they had spent so many afternoons 6 years ago, young and in love and certain of their future. She waited for an hour, her hope slowly curdling into hurt and confusion. Had he received her note? Was he avoiding her? Had Marianne's threats changed his mind? Finally, cold and disappointed, she returned home. That evening, she attended Lady Hartwell's soirée only because her father insisted. Her heart wasn't in it, her mind still circling the unanswered questions. Then Alexander arrived, late, looking stressed and distracted. Relief flooded through her. She could speak with him now, could clear this up. But before she could approach, Marianne intercepted him near the entrance. From across the room, Eveline watched them speaking intently. Marianne's hand touched Alexander's arm, lingered there. She leaned close, her lips near his ear, the picture of intimacy. Alexander's face was tight with anger, but to anyone watching, to Eveline watching, it looked like reconciliation, like intimacy, like everything she feared. The familiar ache of heartbreak bloomed in her chest, stealing her breath. She couldn't bear it, couldn't stand here watching him with Marianne, couldn't face the possibility that she had been foolish enough to trust again. Eveline slipped from the soirée, claiming a headache. In her carriage, she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the walls she had so carefully dismantled trying to rebuild themselves. "I was right the first time," she whispered into the darkness. "Opening my heart again was a mistake." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The pain she felt wasn't the dull ache of an old wound. This was fresh, sharp, immediate, which meant she was vulnerable again, which meant her heart, despite all her vows and all her caution, had already opened, and that terrified her more than anything. Across London, Alexander finally escaped Marianne's clutches, her threats, her manipulations, her poisonous presence. Exhausted and furious, he returned home to find Eveline's note waiting on his desk, delivered yesterday but somehow buried under other correspondence. He read her words with growing horror, checked the time. She had been at Hyde Park hours ago, had waited for him, had left believing he'd ignored her. He cursed, crumpling the note in his fist. Marianne. It had to be Marianne who had interfered with his correspondence, who had ensured this misunderstanding. The distance between himself and Eveline, mere miles across London, might as well have been an ocean. And somewhere in Mayfair, Lady Marianne Ashford smiled into her mirror, satisfied with a day's work well done. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. Lancashire Hall blazed with light on this first Friday of December, every window illuminated, every chandelier sparkling like captured stars. The annual Lancashire Ball was the event of the season, an extravagant affair that drew hundreds of London's elite to admire the famous portrait gallery, marvel at the soaring ceilings adorned with Italian frescoes, and dance beneath crystal chandeliers that had hung in the hall for 3 generations. Eveline arrived with her father, who looked frailer than ever despite his insistence on attending. His cough had worsened throughout the week, each fit seeming to drain more life from him, but when she'd suggested he rest at home, he'd fixed her with a look that reminded her of the man he'd been before illness diminished him. "I won't miss this," he'd said simply. "Not when my daughter is finally living again." She hadn't understood what he meant until Martha had helped her dress and she'd caught sight of herself in the mirror. The gown was deep sapphire silk, rich and vibrant, the first true color she'd worn in 5 years. She had chosen it unconsciously, her hand reaching for it without thought. Only now, standing in Lancashire Hall's glittering entrance, did she understand what it signified. She was no longer in mourning. Not for her lost love, not for her broken heart, not for the woman she'd been before. Alexander destroyed her. She was ready to live again, even if it terrified her. The ballroom was a crush of silk and jewels, perfume and candlelight. Eveline's hand rested on her father's arm as they navigated through the crowd, nodding to acquaintances, accepting greetings from those who'd watched her return to society with fascinated interest. "There's Lady Pemberton," her father said, gesturing toward where Beatrice stood with her husband. "Shall we?" "Eveline." The voice stopped her heart. She turned to find Alexander standing 10 feet away, the crowd parting around him as though even London society recognized something momentous was unfolding. He looked devastated and desperate in equal measure. His evening clothes were impeccable as always, but his eyes, those dark eyes that haunted her dreams, were shadowed with exhaustion and something that looked like fear. "Your Grace." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I've been trying to reach you all week." He took a step closer, then stopped, as though remembering propriety. "I sent notes. I called at your townhouse. I wasn't receiving visitors." The words were cool, but her heart hammered traitorously. Before Alexander could respond, the crowd shifted and Eveline lost sight of him. Bodies pressed between them, ladies in their elaborate gowns, gentlemen seeking refreshment, the constant movement of a London ball. She caught glimpses of him trying to navigate toward her, but the crush was too dense. Then a voice rang out, clear and carrying. "Alexander, darling, you haven't forgotten our dance?" Lady Marianne Ashford materialized at Alexander's side, resplendent in crimson silk that made her look like a flame given human form. She linked her arm through his with possessive familiarity, her smile brilliant and calculated. Across the distance, Eveline watched Alexander's jaw tighten. "Marianne, I don't believe I committed to any such thing. But surely you remember." Marianne's voice was loud enough that nearby guests turned to watch. "When we spoke the other evening, you were so attentive. I naturally assumed." She trailed off with a pretty laugh that suggested intimate understanding. Several matrons exchanged knowing glances. The whispers began immediately. Eveline turned away sharply, her stomach churning. She couldn't watch this, couldn't stand here while Marianne performed her little theatrical designed to stake her claim. "Excuse me, father," she murmured. "I need air." She slipped through the crowd toward the balcony doors, desperate for space to breathe, to think, to rebuild the walls that seemed determined to crumble. The balcony overlooked Lancashire Hall's famous gardens, now bare with winter but still elegant in the moonlight. A few other guests stood in small clusters, seeking relief from the crowded ballroom, but they were far enough away that their conversations were merely murmurs. Eveline gripped the stone balustrade, drawing deep breaths of cold December air. Behind her, she heard the balcony door open again, felt his presence before he spoke. "Eveline, thank God. I've been trying to reach you. Have you?" She didn't turn, keeping her voice cool and controlled. "I hadn't noticed. Your note, about meeting at Hyde Park." Frustration roughened his voice. "I only received it yesterday. It was 3 days old. I would have been there if I'd known." "It doesn't matter." "It does matter." He moved closer, though still maintaining proper distance. "You think I ignored you, that I chose not to come? I would never, wouldn't you?" She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him stop mid-sentence. "Tell me about the letters, Alexander. The ones Marianne has." He froze, and she saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. "You know about that?" "I was at Hatchard's." The words came out flat. "I heard." Alexander closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were filled with something like despair. "She's bluffing, or she's fabricated something. I never wrote her anything that could be misconstrued as, but there's doubt in your voice." Eveline heard the tremor in her own words. "Uncertainty. There's concern for your reputation." His hands clenched at his sides. "Not doubt about my actions. I know what I wrote, formal pleasantries, nothing more. But Marianne is ruthless, Eveline. I don't know what she's capable of creating to hurt you. This is exactly what happened before. The dam inside her broke, and 5 years of buried pain came flooding out. You, caught between duty and love, between what society expects and what your heart wants. And I'm supposed to just trust that this time will be different? It is different. I'm different." He stepped closer, his voice urgent. "I chose wrong once. I won't do it again." "You don't understand." Her voice broke, tears she'd been fighting finally spilling over. "When you left, you didn't just break my heart, you destroyed my ability to trust, to hope, to believe in love itself. I spent 5 years building walls, telling myself I'd never be vulnerable again, that I'd never let anyone close enough to hurt me." She pressed her hand to her chest, as though she could physically hold her heart together. "And then you came back, and somehow, God help me, you got past every defense I built. You made me hope again. You made me feel again. Eveline, I'm terrified." The confession tore from her throat. "Because if I let myself love you again, if I open my heart completely, and you leave again, I won't survive it. I barely survived the first time." Alexander moved closer, close enough that she could see the silver at his temples, the lines of suffering around his eyes, the raw emotion written across his face. "Then let me spend the rest of my life rebuilding what I destroyed." His voice was rough with emotion. "Let me prove that I'm not the boy who chose duty over love. I'm a man now, Eveline, a man who knows the difference between what matters and what doesn't. I was 23 and an idiot." His hands lifted, as though he wanted to touch her, then fell again. "I thought duty meant sacrifice. I thought love was weakness, that feelings were something to be controlled and contained. I was wrong about everything." His voice broke. "My heart never left you. Not for a single day in 5 years. I've been a ghost, going through the motions of living, managing estates and attending Parliament, and doing all the things a duke is supposed to do. But none of it mattered. None of it meant anything, because the only thing that ever mattered was forever out of reach. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately." He drew a shaking breath. "I don't expect you to trust me overnight, but I will prove it to you, every single day, for the rest of my life if necessary. I will show you that choosing you isn't weakness, it's the only brave thing I've ever done." Silence fell between them, broken only by the distant strains of music from the ballroom and Eveline's soft crying. "I never stopped loving you either." The words came out barely above a whisper. "I wanted to. God knows I tried. I told myself I hated you, that I'd forgotten you, that you meant nothing to me. But you don't stop loving someone just because they hurt you. You just learn to live with the pain." She met his eyes, letting him see her completely, the love, the fear, the desperate hope she'd been trying to deny. "And now I don't know what's worse, the pain of losing you before, or the terror of having you back and losing you again." "You won't lose me." Alexander's voice was fierce with conviction. "I swear on everything I hold sacred, my title, my estates, my very life, you won't lose me. Not to duty, not to family expectations, not to threats or scandal or anything else this world can throw at us." How touching. A reconciliation scene worthy of a melodrama. They both turned sharply. Marianne stood in the balcony doorway, her crimson gown making her look like an avenging angel, or perhaps a demon. In her hand, she held a small packet of letters tied with ribbon. "But before this goes any further," she continued, her voice dripping false sweetness, "perhaps Lady Lancaster should see these." Alexander moved immediately, positioning himself between Eveline and Marianne. "This is between us, Marianne. Leave Eveline out of it." "But that's impossible." "Darling." Marianne's smile was sharp as glass. "She's the entire reason I'm doing this. She's the reason you refused me. The reason you threw away what we could have had together." For the first time in 5 years, for the first time since Alexander had destroyed her, Eveline didn't retreat, didn't hide behind walls or masks or carefully constructed indifference. She stepped out from behind Alexander, drawing herself up to her full height, and met Marianne's eyes directly. "What do you want, Lady Marianne?" Marianne blinked, clearly surprised by the directness. "I want what was promised to me. Alexander's name, his title, his place in society, but not his heart." Eveline's voice was steady now, clear. "That was never part of the arrangement, was it?" Marianne's composure slipped slightly. "Love is irrelevant. Position is what matters. Security, status, the respect of society, those are the things that endure. Then I pity you." The words were sincere, not cruel, because I'd rather have one moment of genuine love than a lifetime of empty position. I'd rather have Alexander's heart, freely given, than all the titles and estates in England gained through manipulation. She turned to Alexander, and something shifted in her chest, something that felt like courage, like strength, like the woman she'd been before pain taught her to hide. "Whatever is in those letters, we'll face it together. I'm done running, I'm done hiding, I'm done letting fear make my choices for me." Alexander looked at her as though she'd handed him the world. Then he turned to Marianne, and his expression hardened. "Do your worst. Publish whatever fabrications you have. Ruin my reputation if you must. Drag my name through every scandal sheet in London." His voice rang with conviction. "I don't care. Because standing here with Eveline, choosing love over fear, choosing honesty over propriety, this is the first genuine thing I've done in 5 years." He turned back to Eveline, offering his hand. "I choose you. Openly, publicly, without reservation. Let society talk." Eveline placed her hand in his, and the touch sent warmth flooding through her, melting the last frozen corners of her heart. They stood together, united, and Marianne saw defeat in their joined hands. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "Both of you. Society will. We'll do what society always does," Alexander said calmly. "Talk for a fortnight and then move on to the next scandal. But Eveline and I will still be together. That's what matters." Marianne's face twisted with fury. She spun on her heel and stormed from the balcony, the letters still clutched in her hand. But her power was broken. Without Alexander's fear to feed on, her threats were empty. Several guests who had witnessed the scene from nearby whispered to each other, but Eveline found she didn't care. Let them talk. Let them speculate. She had spent 5 years caring too much what society thought, and it had nearly cost her everything. From inside, the orchestra began a waltz. "Dance with me?" Alexander asked softly. "Everyone will talk. Let them." His eyes held hers, dark and intense and full of love. "I'm done hiding how I feel about you. I want all of London to know that Lady Eveline Lancaster is the woman I love, the only woman I've ever loved, the only woman I ever will love." They returned to the ballroom together, hand in hand. Conversations stopped, heads turned. The whispers began immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. But as Alexander led Eveline onto the floor and they began to waltz, the rest of the world faded away. It was just the two of them, moving together as though they'd never been apart. His hand at her waist felt right, natural, like coming home. Her hand in his felt safe in a way she'd forgotten was possible. "I love you, Eveline Lancaster," Alexander whispered, leaning close enough that his breath stirred the curls at her temple. "I've loved you since I was 22 years old, and I'll love you until I draw my last breath." Eveline looked up at him, at this man who had broken her and was now putting her back together, piece by careful piece. For the first time in 5 years, she allowed herself to speak the complete truth. "I love you too. God help me, I never stopped." The walls around her heart didn't crumble, they dissolved. Like ice in spring sunlight, they simply melted away, leaving her vulnerable and open and more terrified than she'd ever been, but also more alive. For the first time in 5 years, Eveline felt herself truly begin to heal, not by hiding from pain, but by choosing to risk it again, not by building walls, but by taking them down. Around them, London society whispered and speculated, scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. The Duke of Hawk and Lady Lancaster, dancing as though nothing else existed, as though 5 years hadn't passed, as though heartbreak had never happened. But Eveline and Alexander didn't notice. They were too busy rewriting their story together, this time honestly and openly and without fear. And if Eveline's cheeks were wet with tears as they danced, they were tears of joy, of relief, of hope finally allowed to flourish after years of dormancy. Spring had come at last. Chapter 6. When Crisis Reveals Truth. 3 days after the Lancashire ball, Eveline woke to winter sunlight streaming through her bedroom windows and realized, with a start of wonder, that she was happy. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. The sensation was so unfamiliar after 5 years of carefully maintained numbness that for a moment she simply lay still, marveling at it. Then memory supplied the reason. Alexander. They had seen each other every day since the ball-chaperoned walks through Hyde Park, afternoon calls in her drawing room, quiet conversations over tea while her father dozed nearby. They were rebuilding trust, slowly, carefully, like craftsmen restoring something precious that had been broken. Each conversation added another brick, each shared glance another beam. The structure was fragile still, but it was growing stronger. London society gossiped, of course. The Duke of Hawk, courting Lady Lancaster after 5 years apart, provided delicious fodder for speculation, but Eveline found she didn't care. Let them talk. She had wasted too many years caring what society thought, and Marianne had retreated. Her threats had evaporated like morning mist once Alexander made clear he would not be manipulated. Rumour said she'd left London entirely, returning to Paris where she could nurse her wounded pride away from witnesses. Eveline dressed with Martha's help, choosing a morning gown of soft rose another colour, she noted with quiet satisfaction. Her wardrobe was slowly transforming from morning greys to the colours of the living. She descended to breakfast, humming softly, something she couldn't remember doing in years. Her father was already seated at the table, the morning papers spread before him, but something in his posture made her pause in the doorway. He looked diminished somehow, his shoulders hunched, his breathing laboured. "Father?" She moved quickly to his side. "Are you well?" "Quite well, my dear." But his voice was thin, reedy. "Just a bit of a cough, this London air." A footman entered, bearing a silver salver. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but an urgent message has arrived from Silverbrook Manor. The steward says it requires your immediate attention." Eveline's father reached for the letter with trembling hands. As he read, his face drained of what little colour it held. "Serious problems," he muttered. "The bridge has finally collapsed entirely. 3 tenant cottages are in danger of the same. And the creditors." He trailed off, his expression stricken. "Creditors?" Eveline's stomach clenched. "Father, what creditors?" "I must go to Silverbrook immediately. The steward needs." He stood abruptly, and that's when the coughing fit struck. Violent, racking coughs that bent him double. The footman rushed forward to support him, and when her father pulled his handkerchief away from his mouth, Eveline saw what he'd been trying to hide. Bright red blood staining the white linen. "Father!" Terror flooded through her. She caught him as his knees buckled. "Someone fetch the doctor. Now." "The estate," her father gasped between coughs. "There are debts, Eveline. Things I haven't told you." His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed in her arms. The next hours passed in a blur of panic and desperate activity. The doctor came, examined the Earl with grave efficiency, and delivered a diagnosis that made Eveline's world tilt sickeningly. "Advanced consumption, my lady." "Doctor." Hartwell's voice was gentle but firm. "The same illness that took the old Duke of Hawk. Your father has been hiding symptoms for months, I suspect." "How long?" The words scraped from Eveline's throat. "How long does he have?" "That depends. With immediate rest, country air, and absolutely no stress, he may survive the winter, may even see spring." The doctor paused. "But without proper care, without removing him from London's damp air." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. "I'll take him to Silverbrook immediately." "That would be wise." "But my lady," the doctor hesitated, "the stress of his illness alone could kill him. Any additional burdens?" Eveline nodded numbly. Her father was dying. The same illness that had trapped Alexander 5 years ago was now stealing her only remaining parent. The estate steward arrived from Silverbrook while the Earl lay sleeping. Laudanum induced rest, the only thing that stopped his coughing. Thomas Weatherby was a practical man who'd served the Lancaster family for 30 years, and the devastation in his eyes told Eveline everything before he spoke a word. "The Earl took loans, my lady." Weatherby spread documents across the drawing-room table with shaking hands. "To maintain the estate, to fund your London season, to keep up appearances. He didn't want you to worry," he said. "Didn't want you to feel obligated to marry for money." Eveline stared at the numbers, but they seemed to swim before her eyes. "How much?" £15,000. "The debts have come due. Multiple creditors, all demanding payment." Weatherby's voice was hollow. "If we cannot pay, they will seize Silverbrook Manor. We have 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Her father dying, her childhood home about to be torn away, everything crumbling around her like sandcastles before the tide." "There must be something we can do," Eveline said, but even she could hear the desperation in her voice. "The investments, the rents, already accounted for in these figures, my lady. I'm sorry, truly sorry." After Weatherby left, Eveline sat alone in the drawing-room, surrounded by papers that spelled out her family's ruin. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to think, to plan, to find some solution that didn't exist. "Eveline," Beatrice's voice made her look up. Her friend stood in the doorway, concern written across her face. "I heard about your father. I came as soon as I could." Beatrice crossed the room quickly, taking Eveline's cold hands in her warm ones. "What can I do?" "Nothing. There's nothing anyone can do." Eveline gestured at the papers. "We're ruined, Beatrice. Completely ruined." Beatrice read through the documents, her expression growing more troubled with each page. Finally, she looked up. "Ask Alexander." "No." The word came out sharp. "Immediate." "Eveline, he has the means to help. He would want. I won't be in his debt." Eveline pulled her hands away, standing to pace the room. "I won't be the destitute woman he rescued out of pity. Everyone will say I was with him for his money, that I was playing at pride until I needed rescue. It wouldn't be pity. It would be love. I need to stand on my own." Eveline's voice cracked. "Don't you see? I need to know that what we have is real, that it's not built on dependence or obligation or debt." She spent the afternoon desperately seeking solutions. She sold her mother's jewelry, the few pieces that weren't entailed, raising barely £1,000. She contacted banks, only to be told they wouldn't lend to a woman without a male guarantor. She wrote to distant relatives, knowing even as she penned the letters that they would refuse. Alexander called at the townhouse that evening. The butler, following Eveline's instructions, told him Lady Lancaster was not receiving visitors. He called again the next morning, and the morning after that, he left flowers, notes expressing concern. All went unanswered. On the third day, as Eveline was preparing to leave for Silverbrook with her father, she encountered Beatrice on the doorstep. "I told him," Beatrice said without preamble, "about the debts, about Silverbrook. I'm sorry, Eveline, but I couldn't stand by and watch you destroy yourself out of pride. You had no right." "I had every right as your friend." Beatrice's voice was firm. "He wants to help. He's desperate to help. I won't accept his charity." "Then you're a fool." Beatrice's eyes blazed. "Love isn't about standing alone, Eveline. It's about having someone stand with you." But Eveline had already climbed into the carriage beside her sleeping father, and within the hour they were on the road to Silverbrook. The journey took 2 days, her father drifting in and out of fevered consciousness. By the time they arrived at Silverbrook Manor, Eveline was exhausted, terrified, and utterly alone. She spent 3 days in a fog of desperate activity, managing her father's care, meeting with the estate workers about repairs they couldn't afford, reviewing accounts that offered no solutions. Late at night, she sat in her father's study, surrounded by ledgers and letters from creditors, and tried not to weep. It was on such a night, past midnight, that she heard a knock at the study door. "Martha, I said I didn't want to be disturbed." She looked up and froze. Alexander stood in the doorway, snow dusting his greatcoat, his dark eyes intense in the firelight. "What are you doing here?" The words came out barely above a whisper. "I heard you needed help." He stepped into the room, and she saw exhaustion in the lines of his face. He'd ridden hard to reach her. "I came." "Alexander, I can't." "Accept my charity?" He moved closer, but kept the desk between them. "I know," Beatrice told me, But hear me out before you refuse. There's nothing to hear. I won't be in your debt. I won't let everyone say, it's not charity, it's partnership. His voice was gentle but firm. It's what people who love each other do. They help each other. You don't understand. Frustrated tears spilled over despite her best efforts. If I take your money, everyone will say I'm with you for your wealth. That I was playing at pride until I needed rescue. They'll say I trapped you, manipulated you. I don't care what anyone says. But I do. The words burst from her. I need to know that what we have is real, that it's not built on dependence or obligation or debt. Alexander moved around the desk, close enough now that she could see the snowflakes melting in his hair. Eveline, love is already a form of dependence. We depend on each other for happiness, for companionship, for understanding. You've already given me more than I could ever repay. You gave me forgiveness I didn't deserve. Is that so different from accepting help when you need it? She stared at him, wanting to believe, terrified to accept. What if it's not a gift? He said quietly. What if it's a loan, with full legal documentation, interest, repayment terms? Everything proper and businesslike. I can't promise when I could repay £15,000. Then we'll structure it over years, decades if necessary. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. The point isn't the money, Eveline. The point is that I can help, and you need help. And love means not letting pride destroy us. Why? Her voice broke. Why would you do this? Because the woman I love is in pain, and I have the power to ease it. His thumb traced circles on her palm. What kind of man would I be if I stood by and did nothing? In the end, it was the simple sincerity in his eyes that broke her resistance. A loan, she said finally, with full legal terms, and I will repay you, every penny. Of course, he smiled, and she saw relief flood his features. They both knew she might never be able to repay such a sum, but the fiction allowed her to accept. Alexander stayed. He stayed for a week that stretched into 2, then 3. He handled the creditors with quiet efficiency, negotiating terms and settling debts. Eveline managed her father's care and the estate's daily operations. They worked side by side, late into the night, reviewing accounts and planning improvements. Martha chaperoned, but she gave them space, recognizing that something profound was developing in those quiet hours. The intimacy that grew between them was different from what they'd shared 6 years ago. This wasn't the passionate rush of young love, but something deeper, more solid, built not on idealism but on genuine partnership. They took meals together in the breakfast room, discussing tenant concerns and crop rotations. Alexander read to the Earl when he was lucid enough to listen, keeping him company during long afternoons. By the fire at night, after everyone else had retired, they talked about everything, their fears, their hopes, the future they might build together. One night, Eveline fell asleep in the library chair, exhausted from a day spent managing repairs. She woke briefly to find Alexander carrying her up the stairs, Martha following with a candle. "I can walk," she murmured against his chest. "I know. Let me do this anyway." He tucked her into bed with Martha's supervision, the tenderness of the gesture making tears spring to Martha's eyes. As her father slowly began to recover, the country air and rest working their slow magic, he watched them together with knowing eyes. One afternoon, he called Eveline to his bedside. "I was wrong about him," the Earl said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "That man loves you beyond measure." "I know, Father. I won't live forever." He held up a hand when she started to protest. "Consumption is, we both know. But I can die peacefully knowing you'll have someone who loves you as I loved your mother. Don't speak of dying." Tears streamed down her face. "I want to see you married, darling. Before, while I still can." Christmas week arrived, and Alexander had been at Silverbrook for 3 weeks, leaving only once to handle urgent business in London. The manor was decorated simply holly and ivy, candles in the windows, but it felt warmer than it had in years. On Christmas Eve, Alexander found Eveline in the gardens, where snow lay pristine and white beneath a clear winter sky. "Do you remember?" he asked, gesturing to the rose arbor, now bare of blooms. "I gave you a rose here once, made ridiculous promises about eternal spring." "I remember everything." She smiled up at him. "The good and the painful. I want to create new memories, better ones." His hand found hers. "If you'll let me." They walked together through the snowy gardens, and Eveline felt something settle in her chest, something like peace, like certainty, like home. That night, she stood at her bedroom window, watching snow continue to fall. Alexander had kissed her forehead before retiring, a chaste but tender gesture that spoke of restrained passion and genuine respect. 3 weeks ago, her world had been collapsing. Now, because of Alexander's help, her father was recovering, the estate was secure, and her heart, her carefully guarded heart, was fully, irrevocably his. She wasn't afraid anymore. Tomorrow, she decided, she would tell him. Tell him she was ready, ready to forgive completely, ready to trust fully, ready to build a future together. Her vow never to love again was broken, and she'd never been happier about being wrong. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Silverbrook in white. Inside, something precious was being rebuilt. Not just trust, not just love, but hope. And hope, Eveline had learned, was the bravest thing of all. Chapter 7. The Ultimate Sacrifice. New Year's Day dawned clear and cold over Silverbrook Manor, sunlight glittering on snow-covered grounds that looked like something from a fairy tale. Inside, the house stirred to life with a sense of cautious optimism that had been absent for weeks. The Earl of Silverbrook was much improved. He still coughed, still tired easily, but the blood had stopped appearing on his handkerchiefs and colour had returned to his cheeks. Dr. Hartwell, who'd made the journey from London to examine him, pronounced himself cautiously pleased with the patient's progress. "Country air and rest," he'd said, nodding approvingly. "And I suspect having his daughter happy again hasn't hurt." Eveline was happy, genuinely, radiantly happy in a way she'd thought lost to her forever. The holidays at Silverbrook had transformed her relationship with Alexander from tentative reconciliation into something deeper, more solid. They'd worked together, laughed together, built something real from the ruins of what had been destroyed. There was an easy intimacy between them now, shared glances across the breakfast table that spoke volumes, his hand finding hers during evening, walks through the snowy gardens, quiet conversations by the fire that lasted until the small hours. They were partners in every sense, and Eveline had never felt more certain of anything. London society knew they were courting. Letters from Beatrice kept them apprised of the gossip most approved of the match. Some whispered about the speed of it. A few predicted disaster. Eveline didn't care. She'd wasted too many years caring what society thought. "We should return to London in 2 days," Alexander said over breakfast, setting down his teacup. "Resume our proper courtship before society. Give the gossips something real to discuss, instead of speculation." "Must we?" Eveline smiled. "I've grown rather fond of having you all to myself." Her father chuckled from his seat at the head of the table. "You sound like a woman in love, daughter." "I am." She met Alexander's eyes, feeling warmth bloom in her chest at his expression. Terribly, hopelessly in love. After breakfast, Alexander announced he was riding to the village to collect correspondence. He returned an hour later, and Eveline knew immediately something was wrong. His expression was carefully neutral, too neutral, and he was quieter than usual. "What's wrong?" she asked, catching him in the hallway outside the library. "Nothing that concerns you." But his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just estate business." "Alexander, truly, it's nothing." He kissed her forehead, but the gesture felt distracted. "I need to review some documents. I'll see you at luncheon." He disappeared into the library before she could press further, and for the rest of the day he remained withdrawn. Present in body but absent in spirit, his mind clearly occupied with whatever news he'd received. Eveline tried not to worry, tried to tell herself it was nothing, but anxiety gnawed at her nonetheless. That evening, as dusk was falling, an unexpected visitor arrived. Lady Catherine Hawke, travel-stained and distressed, appeared in a hired carriage and immediately requested private audience with Eveline. They retired to the small drawing room, and the moment the door closed, Catherine's composure crumbled. "You have to stop him," she said without preamble, tears streaming down her face. "He won't listen to me. I've tried everything, but he's determined." "Stop him from what?" Eveline took Catherine's hands, alarmed. "Catherine, what's happened?" "Alexander." Catherine drew a shaking breath. "He's been quietly liquidating assets, selling properties, divesting investments, transferring funds. I didn't understand at first what he was doing, but then I saw the documents he'd left on his desk in London." Eveline's stomach dropped. "What documents?" Catherine pulled papers from her reticule with trembling hands. "He's preparing to give up everything. His fortune. Most of his properties, he's transferring them to Mother and me." He plans to keep only a modest income and step away from his duties as Duke. The words made no sense. Eveline stared at the legal documents, seeing Alexander's signature, but unable to comprehend what she was reading. Why would he do that? Because of you. Catherine's voice broke. Because of what you said about not being dependent on his wealth. He's convinced that the only way you'll truly trust his love is if he has nothing to offer but himself. The room seemed to tilt. Eveline sank into a chair, her mind racing. He can't do this. His responsibilities, his tenants. I've tried to tell him. Catherine knelt beside Eveline's chair. But he won't listen. He says duty cost him you once, and he refuses to let anything title, wealth, position stand between you again. He says if choosing you means giving up everything else, then that's what he'll do. Eveline pressed her hands to her face, torn between horror at the foolishness of the plan and awe at the magnitude of his love. He was willing to sacrifice everything, his entire life, his responsibilities, his place in society, to prove he chose her freely. You have to tell him you don't need this grand gesture, Catherine pleaded, that you love him as he is, that he doesn't have to destroy himself to prove his love. Meanwhile, in London, Lady Marianne Ashford was making plans of her own. She'd learned of Alexander's liquidation through her brother, who'd heard it from his banker. At first, she'd been confused. Why would the Duke of Hawk divest himself of his fortune? Then, understanding had dawned, followed by cold fury. He was doing it for her, for that insipid Lancaster woman who'd done nothing but hide in the country for 5 years. If Marianne couldn't have Alexander, she would ensure no one else could either. She retrieved the letters she'd spent weeks forging clever fabrications that suggested impropriety between herself and Alexander during their engagement. They were lies, complete lies, but they were expertly done. Even she had to admit they looked genuine. She arranged to meet with publishers of 3 different scandal sheets. The letters would appear in 2 days, timed to cause maximum damage, just as Alexander and Eveline returned to London. Her revenge would be complete. That night, Eveline found Alexander in the library, surrounded by ledgers and legal documents. He looked up when she entered, and guilt flashed across his face before he could hide it. "Catherine told me what you're planning," Eveline said quietly, closing the door behind her. Alexander set down his pen. "I suppose there's no point in denying it. Why, Alexander? Why would you do this?" "Because I need you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with duty or position." He stood, moving around the desk toward her. "I need you to know I'm choosing you, only you, without any obligations or responsibilities clouding the choice." "By giving up everything?" Eveline's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "That's just another form of duty. Duty to prove yourself. Duty to some impossible standard of sacrifice. You said you needed to know our relationship wasn't built on dependence or wealth, and I was wrong." She closed the distance between them, taking his hands. "I was letting old fears control me. I was so afraid of being dependent that I couldn't see the truth." "What truth?" "That love requires trust. That partnership means accepting help when you need it. That standing together is stronger than standing alone." She held his gaze. "I don't need you to be poor to know you love me. I need you to be honest, to choose me freely, to trust me with the truth. That's what I've needed all along." Alexander's expression was torn. "When I chose duty over love before, it destroyed us. I can't let that happen again. When you chose duty over love before, the problem wasn't that you had responsibilities." Eveline's voice was gentle but firm. "It was that you didn't trust me enough to face them together. You tried to bear everything alone, and it broke us both." She squeezed his hands. "Don't make the opposite mistake. Don't abandon your responsibilities to prove a point. Your tenants need you. Your estates need proper management. Your title isn't just privilege, it's obligation to people who depend on you." "But how do I prove?" "You already have." She reached up, touching his face. "You came when I needed you. You stayed. You worked beside me, instead of trying to solve everything yourself. You let me be part of the solution. That's what I needed. That's what love looks like." Before Alexander could respond, urgent knocking sounded at the library door. A footman entered, bearing a message. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but this just arrived from London." The messenger said it was urgent. Alexander broke the seal, and as he read, his face drained of color. He passed the letter to Eveline without a word. It was from his solicitor. Lady Marianne had fabricated letters, expertly forged documents, suggesting impropriety between herself and Alexander during their engagement. She planned to publish them in 2 days in multiple scandal sheets. The letters would claim his courtship of Eveline was guilt-driven, that he'd been unfaithful, that everything was a lie. "This is my nightmare," Alexander said, his voice hollow. "Your reputation threatened because of me, because of my past mistakes. Then we'll face it." Eveline set down the letter, her voice steady. "Together, Eveline, this could destroy you, ruin your name completely. Only if we act like we have something to hide. Only if we let her control the narrative." She took his hands again. "We have the truth. You have the real engagement documents proving it was purely formal. Catherine can testify about the family pressure. My father, though weak, will come to London to support us publicly. The scandal will pass. Scandal always does." She smiled at him. "I'm done being afraid, Alexander. I'm done letting the past control my future. We'll go to London. We'll face society together, and we'll show them that whatever Marianne fabricates can't touch what we have." Alexander looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, this woman who'd spent 5 years hiding from life, now ready to face the worst society could throw at them. In the quiet after the storm of revelation, he sank to his knees before her, not as a duke with power and wealth to offer, not as a man trying to prove himself through grand gestures, just as himself, flawed, human, desperately in love. "Eveline Lancaster," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've loved you since I was 22 years old. I made mistakes, terrible ones that hurt you deeply. But if you can forgive me, if you can trust me one more time, I swear I will spend every day of my life being worthy of that trust." Tears streamed down Eveline's face. "I'm not asking you to depend on me," he continued. "I'm asking you to build a life with me as partners, as equals, as two people who choose each other freely, every single day, who face troubles together instead of alone, who trust each other with the truth, even when it's difficult." He looked up at her, his dark eyes holding everything: love, fear, hope, determination. "Will you marry me?" All the years of pain, all the walls, all the vows to never love again, they had led to this moment. This man, kneeling before her, offering not wealth or position but himself, his love, his partnership, his absolute commitment. "Yes," Eveline whispered, then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because you're a duke, not because you saved my estate, not out of duty or obligation or fear." She pulled him to his feet, her hands framing his face. "But because you're the only man I've ever loved, and because I finally believe in you, in us, in second chances." He kissed her, then their first real kiss in 6 years. Tender and passionate, hesitant and certain, full of all the love and pain and hope that lay between them. It tasted of tears and promises, of healing and new beginnings. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "We leave for London at dawn," he said. "Together." "Together," he agreed. "We'll face whatever comes." That night, they made plans. Catherine would travel with them. The Earl would follow as soon as he was strong enough. They would confront Marianne's lies with truth, face society with dignity, and refuse to let scandal destroy what they'd rebuilt. Alexander wouldn't sacrifice his position. Eveline had shown him that running from responsibility wasn't the answer, but he would sacrifice society's good opinion, if necessary, to protect her. And Eveline wouldn't hide or retreat. She'd spent 5 years running from life. Never again. In the pre-dawn darkness, Eveline and Alexander stood together in Silverbrook's front hall, cloaked against the January cold, preparing to depart for London. "Are you afraid?" Alexander asked, taking her hand. Eveline looked at him, this man who'd been willing to give up everything for her, who'd loved her through years of her hatred, who'd never stopped choosing her, even when she wouldn't choose him back. "No," she said honestly. "For the first time in 5 years, I'm not afraid at all." Because she finally understood. Love wasn't about avoiding pain or preventing loss. It wasn't about grand gestures or noble sacrifices. It was about finding someone worth facing the pain and risking the loss for. Someone worth standing beside, no matter what storms came. As their carriage rolled toward London, toward scandal and confrontation and uncertainty, Eveline felt nothing but peace. She'd vowed never to open her heart again. Thank God she'd been wrong. Chapter 8. A Love Worth Fighting For. London greeted them with scandal. The morning they arrived, Alexander and Eveline found the city already buzzing with gossip. The fabricated letters had been published in 3 separate scandal sheets, each more lurid than the last. The claims were devastating. Alexander had pursued Eveline while still emotionally entangled with Marianne. His courtship was driven by guilt, not love. Eveline was a desperate spinster grasping at scraps, willing to accept a man who'd publicly humiliated her years before. Society, predictably, was divided. Some believed the lies immediately. Scandal was always more entertaining than truth. Others waited, reserving judgment, curious to see how the Duke and Lady Lancaster would respond. Eveline read the worst of the articles over breakfast at their hotel, her hands steady despite the vitriol on the pages before her. Alexander watched her carefully, tension written in every line of his body. "We don't have to do this today," he said quietly. "We could wait. Let the storm pass." "No." Eveline set down the paper, meeting his eyes. "We face it now, together." Lady Pemberton's afternoon salon was scheduled for that very day, and when the invitation arrived, hand-delivered with a note expressing Beatrice's unwavering support, Eveline knew what she had to do. They arrived at the Pemberton townhouse to find the salon already crowded. Conversation stuttered and died as they were announced. Every eye turned to watch them enter, the whispers beginning immediately. And there, holding court near the windows like a queen receiving supplicants, stood Lady Marianne Ashford. She wore black, as though in mourning, and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as she spoke to a cluster of sympathetic ladies. Eveline felt Alexander tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand and moved forward with her head held high. Beatrice rushed to greet them, her expression fierce with loyalty. "Thank God you've come. Half this room is ready to believe anything, but the other half knows Marianne for what she is." "Then let's give them the truth," Eveline said calmly. She moved to the center of the room, and the murmuring ceased. Every person present seemed to hold their breath, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. "Ladies, gentlemen," Eveline began, her voice clear and steady. "I understand there are questions about the Duke of Hawk and myself. Given the scurrilous rumors currently circulating, I believe clarity is warranted." She felt Alexander move to stand beside her, a solid presence offering silent support. "6 years ago, the Duke and I were courting. We were young and very much in love." Her voice didn't waver. "During that time, the Duke's father lay dying of consumption. On his deathbed, he demanded that his son fulfill a long-standing betrothal contract to Lady Marianne Ashford, threatening disinheritance and ruin for the entire Hawke family if he refused." The room was utterly silent. The Duke, believing he had no choice and wishing to protect his younger sister, complied with his dying father's wishes. The engagement was announced, and my heart was broken. She paused, letting them absorb this. "But what many of you may not know is that the engagement to Lady Marianne was dissolved 5 years ago, shortly after the old Duke's death. Any suggestion of ongoing entanglement is demonstrably false. From her reticule, she produced documents, the official dissolution agreement, signed by both Alexander and Marianne, dated 5 years prior. She handed them to Lady Pemberton, who examined them with shrewd eyes. "These appear entirely legitimate," Lady Pemberton announced. Properly witnessed and sealed, Marianne's face had gone white, but she rallied. "Those documents prove nothing about his current intentions. He's courting her out of guilt. Lady Marianne has, unfortunately, fabricated correspondence," Alexander said, his voice coldly formal, cutting through her protests. "Letters designed to damage Lady Lancaster's reputation and cast doubt on the sincerity of my affections. I have already instructed my solicitors to pursue legal action for libel and forgery." The room erupted in whispers. Marianne's composure finally cracked. "You wouldn't dare." "I would dare anything to protect the woman I love." Alexander's voice rang with conviction. "Lady Marianne received substantial compensation 5 years ago in exchange for her silence regarding the dissolved engagement. She has violated that agreement, and she will face the consequences." Lady Pemberton, the unquestioned leader of their social circle, looked from the documents to Marianne's stricken face, and her expression hardened. "Lady Marianne," she said icily, "I believe you owe His Grace and Lady Lancaster an apology." But Marianne, cornered and humiliated, could only stare at them with hatred burning in her eyes. Then she turned and fled the salon, her black gown sweeping behind her like a dark cloud. The moment she left, the atmosphere transformed. Suddenly everyone wanted to congratulate them, to express their support, to distance themselves from the scandal they'd so eagerly consumed hours before. The tide had turned. Over the next week, the scandal died as quickly as it had ignited. Marianne's brother, mortified by his sister's behavior, sent her back to Paris with a stern warning never to return to London. The Tun, always eager for a love story, embraced the romance of Alexander and Eveline's reunion, second chances, true love triumphant, all the elements of a fairy tale. When the Earl of Silverbrook arrived in London, still weak but determined, he publicly gave his blessing to the match. The engagement announcement appeared in the newspapers. His Grace, the Duke of Hawke, to wed Lady Eveline Lancaster, daughter of the Earl of Silverbrook. Wedding to take place at St. George's Church, Hanover Square. The wedding date was set for 4 weeks hence, and London society couldn't have been more delighted. The weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Eveline and Beatrice spent happy afternoons shopping for her trousseau, selecting muslins and silks, choosing bonnets and gloves, all the pretty things she'd denied herself for 5 years. Catherine threw herself into wedding planning with enthusiasm, handling the endless details that threatened to overwhelm. The Earl insisted on hosting the wedding breakfast at Lancaster House, despite Eveline's concerns about his health. "I will see my daughter properly married," he said with a flash of his old authority. "I won't have it any other way." Alexander handled arrangements with St. George's Church, and in between the necessary tasks, he and Eveline found quiet moments together, walking in Hyde Park, attending the theatre, simply being together without the weight of the past pressing down on them. One evening, a week before the wedding, Alexander presented her with a gift wrapped in silk. Eveline unwrapped it to find a bundle of letters, tied with ribbon letters in her own hand, yellowed with age. "My letters," she whispered, recognizing her younger self's handwriting, "from 6 years ago." "I kept every one," Alexander admitted, his voice rough. "Even after everything fell apart. I couldn't let you go, even when I thought I had to." Eveline read through them with tears streaming down her face, the hopes and dreams of a girl who'd believed in eternal spring, who'd loved without reservation, who'd had no idea how much pain the world could hold. "She was so young," Eveline said softly, "so naive. She was brave enough to love openly." Alexander took her hand, "and she taught me what it meant to have something worth fighting for." The night before the wedding, Eveline stood in her room at the townhouse while Martha helped her prepare for bed. "Nervous, my lady?" Martha asked, brushing out Eveline's hair. "No." Eveline met her own eyes in the mirror and was surprised to find she meant it. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." After Martha left, a note arrived delivered by Alexander's valet with strict instructions that she read it immediately. "Tomorrow, we begin forever. I love you. A." Eveline pressed the note to her heart, smiling through tears of joy. The wedding morning dawned crisp and clear, February sunlight streaming through her bedroom windows. Her room became a flurry of activity as Beatrice, Catherine, and Martha helped her dress. Her gown was ivory silk with delicate Chantilly lace, elegant and sophisticated without being ostentatious. Her hair was dressed with her mother's pearls, the style softer and more romantic than the severe arrangements she'd favored for 5 years. "You look beautiful," Catherine breathed, her eyes bright with tears. "Alexander won't be able to breathe when he sees you." "I'm so happy for you," Beatrice added, embracing her carefully to avoid crushing the gown. "You deserve every bit of this joy." A knock sounded, and the Earl entered, formal in his finest clothes, though the effort clearly cost him. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes filling with tears. "You look just as your mother did on our wedding day," he said softly. "She would be so proud of the woman you've become." He offered his arm, and Eveline took it, feeling the tremor in his muscles. "Ready, my dear." "Ready, father." St. George's Church in Hanover Square was magnificent, filled with London's elite. White roses and winter greenery adorned every surface, and hundreds of candles created a warm, intimate glow despite the grand space. The organ began to play. The guests rose. Eveline walked down the aisle on her father's arm, but she saw only Alexander. He stood at the altar in his formal black, and when their eyes met, the expression on his face stole her breath. Pure love, awe, joy. A man looking at his entire world. The ceremony was traditional but deeply felt. When it came time for their vows, they'd written their own additions, words that spoke to the journey they'd traveled. "Alexander," Eveline said, her voice clear despite her tears, "I vow to trust you with my heart, my fears, my dreams. I vow to choose you, freely and joyfully, every day of my life. I vow to build a future with you, not despite the past, but because of what it taught us." Alexander's voice was thick with emotion as he responded, "Eveline, I vow to be worthy of your trust. I vow to choose love over duty, partnership over pride, us over everything. I vow to spend my life proving that second chances can be more beautiful than first ones. I vow to love you not just on easy days, but on hard ones. Not just when we agree, but when we disagree. Not just in joy, but in sorrow, forever." They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that symbolized eternity. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife. Their kiss was tender, meaningful, a promise sealed before God and witnesses. The wedding breakfast at Lancaster House was elegant and joyful. The Earl, gathering his remaining strength, gave a touching toast. "To my daughter and her Duke, may your love continue to grow stronger with each passing day. May you face life's challenges together and find joy in each other always." Alexander's toast brought tears to many eyes. "To my wife, the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. Thank you for giving me a second chance I didn't deserve. I will spend my life being worthy of it." There was dancing, laughter, celebration. Society had fully embraced them, the scandal forgotten, as though it had never been. Old friends congratulated them. New friendships were forged. Marianne's shadow was finally, completely gone. Late that afternoon, Alexander and Eveline departed for Silverbrook Manor for their honeymoon. Rice and cheers followed them to their carriage. As London disappeared behind them, Eveline rested her head on Alexander's shoulder, feeling peace settle over her like a benediction. They arrived at Silverbrook as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The manor, once a prison of grief, now represented new beginnings. Alexander insisted on carrying her over the threshold. She laughed, calling him traditional, but secretly loved the gesture. That evening, they dined quietly together, just the two of them, speaking of the future, splitting time between London and Silverbrook, managing the estates together, the family they hoped to build, all the tomorrows stretching before them. Later, Eveline found herself in her old chambers, standing before the same mirror where this story had begun. But everything had transformed. Alexander came to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist. "Look," he said softly. "Do you see her?" Eveline studied her reflection, eyes bright with joy, face soft with love. The weight of 5 years of grief finally lifted. She saw a woman who'd been broken and learned to heal, a woman who'd built walls and found the strength to tear them down, a woman who'd vowed never to love again and was brave enough to break that vow. "I see a woman who survived," she whispered. Alexander kissed her temple. "I see the woman I will love for the rest of my life. I see my wife, my partner, my future." Eveline turned in his arms to face him. "I see my husband, the man who never gave up on us." They stood together in comfortable silence, the manor settling around them. Outside, winter was beginning to yield to early spring. Inside, warmth filled every room, not just from the fires, but from the love they'd fought so hard to reclaim. Later, they moved to the window, looking out over Silverbrook's grounds, the same gardens where Alexander had once courted her, where he'd pressed a rose into her hand and promised eternal spring. "Any regrets?" Alexander asked. Eveline thought of everything, the pain, the years lost, the walls she'd built, the fear that had almost kept her from this happiness. "No," she said honestly. "Every moment, even the painful ones, led us here, and here is exactly where I want to be." She reached up, touching his face gently. "You once promised me every season would be eternal spring, but I don't want that anymore." Alexander looked confused, and she smiled. "I want all the seasons. Spring's hope, summer's warmth, autumn's change, even winter's cold. Because the seasons teach us that nothing is permanent, not pain, not loss, not even fear. And love that survives all seasons, that's a love worth having." Outside, the first crocuses pushed through the winter-hard ground. Inside Silverbrook Manor, two people who'd lost each other and fought their way back stood together, ready for whatever came next. Eveline Lancaster had vowed never to open her heart again, but the Duke she'd once hated, the man she now loved, with every fibre of her being, had risked everything to prove that broken hearts can heal, that closed doors can open, and that second chances at love are the most precious chances of all. Not because they come easily, but because they require the courage to hope again. The clock chimed the hour. But it no longer measured pain or loss or wasted years. It simply marked the beginning of their forever. Some stories end where they began. This one began anew with two hearts, once broken, now whole, together. And so, dear listeners, Eveline and Alexander's story reminds us that even the deepest wounds can heal when we find the courage to trust again. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't the ones that unfold easily. They're the ones that require us to be brave enough to hope even after our hearts have been broken. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had a second chance at something precious? Do you believe broken trust can truly be rebuilt? Share your thoughts. I read every single comment, and your stories inspire the tales I bring to you. And if you're new to Lyra's romance stories, welcome. Please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a story. We explore the depths of love in all its forms. Here, the passionate, the painful, the healing, and the hopeful. If you enjoyed Eveline and Alexander's journey, you might also love these stories. She was labelled mad and exiled by her stepmother until the most feared duke in London demanded, "She will be my duchess." Until our next story, dear listeners, remember, love is not about perfection. It's about finding someone who sees your scars and chooses to stay. It's about being brave enough to open your heart, even when fear whispers that you shouldn't. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for letting me share these stories of the heart with you. This is Lyra, reminding you that second chances are always worth fighting for. Until next time, may your own love story be everything you've dreamed.